I'm going to record right now so that we can have this session on file for some of our friends that registered but were unable to attend. If you don't wish to participate in a live recorded session, feel free to opt out at this moment, and we will send you the recording for you to view at your leisure. Otherwise, I think we can move forward. And just to let you know, for our latecomers, we will have Q&A at the end. I will keep everybody on mute, but if you do have a question or a comment that you'd like to add to the presentation, feel free to unmute and have a dialogue, join the conversation. That being said, it is always a conversation, an ongoing conversation with Marketo user groups. I'd love it if you would be as kind to go to your bevy interface and navigate to the Tucson Mug and join us, right? Even if you don't live in Tucson, most of our events, if not almost all, are virtual, and we'd love to have you stay apprised of future events for our user group. So feel free to sign up. Cool. So upcoming opportunities for chapter members. A friendly reminder about the certification process and how things are pivoting a bit. So if you haven't gotten certified, this is a wonderful place. If you have any questions around what certification looks like, reach out to one of us. I myself am 5X certified, was one of the first 200 people to ever get Marketo certified. So I've got a decent amount of experience with the process. And there are various levels right now that are being offered: the professional level, the certified expert level, and the certified master, also known as the Engage Architect. We're lucky enough today to have a certified MCSA on the call, and she's going to be presenting. So if you have any questions about certification, do bring them up at the end of today's presentation. All right,
awesome.
Cool. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to my friend and colleague, Andy Carone, to talk to us today.
Hey, all, excited to be joining you today to talk about attribution and analytics in general. That it pertains to understanding how marketing is performing and optimizing that performance. So I am someone who definitely prefers to be interactive. So for this group, if that's something that feels normal or you're comfortable with, I find that questions as they come to us have much more connectivity with what we're actually talking about, and the context is much deeper. And so the answer is going to be a little bit more relevant and pertinent at that moment. So if you want to come off of mute and ask a question, I welcome that. Please pause me, halt me in my tracks. If I'm confusing and you want more clarity on something, or you're trying to double click in on something, I welcome that always. Lauren will be monitoring questions coming in also via chat. So Lauren may pause me to ask a question. If you do want to wait until the end to ask something, totally fine. We'll go off of record at the end for questions. So if there's something you wanted to ask, like not on the record, that's fine too. And then obviously, as Lauren said, I will be happy to answer other questions at the end related to MCSA or anything else that might pertain to my background and experience that is a curious moment for you. So I'm Andy Carone. I'm the SVP of Consulting at Revenue Pulse. I've been there for over 4 years and helped grow out the consulting function there within the organization. Marketo is generally my happy place when I'm at work. And when I'm not at work, my happy place is with my kids. I have a 4-year-old son and twin girls who are 16 months old. And yes, that sounds exactly like it is. In addition to being an MCSA or certified Marketo Engage Master at the architect level, I'm also part of the inaugural class of the Fearless 50. I'm user group leader in Chicago, which is where I reside, and I am a 3-time Marketo champion. All right, so we're going to focus on 3 areas today. We're going to dive into talking about attribution and the maturity of attribution within your own organization. You're thinking about it. We're going to talk about automating attribution data in Marketo Engage and CRM. And then we're going to finally focus on evolving attribution maturity to ROI and what that means, because ROI is a function or extension of attribution, but attribution as a discipline is really just about looking at tying revenue to engagement and not necessarily the investment that that engagement had or cost. And so we want to level set on that as well, just to give us that clarity, I think, around calling things the same names and having, you know, that capacity within the organization to really have those cross-functional conversations with sales, with, you know, your finance department, all the people that are ultimately caring about the results that you're driving as a marketer and within your organization. So let's go ahead and kick forward into attribution maturity. So I would be willing to bet that you have been at some level on this maturity curve at some point and can probably pinpoint where you are now. But I think in general, there's 3 buckets of maturity that organizations and individuals tend to go through as it relates to attribution and analyzing the success or failure of your campaigns. The first is around describing impact. What did we do? What was the impact that that thing had? The second is around defining impact. Did we drive revenue? Did we drive net new people into the database both? Did we, you know, meet whatever that agenda was? What was the impact of this? How do we define that at large? And then finally, determining impact. So this idea of forward-looking, you know, forecasting, predicting outcomes, and then machine learning, those types of things. So all of these are good conversations to be having in your organization, whether it is ad hoc analyses of a specific campaign or subset of campaigns, starting to build out your foundation, all the way to, you know, utilizing some sort of machine learning model that's going to look at what you've done and then tell you maybe what to look at doing in the future. I think the most important thing is understanding where you are in the maturity curve and then mapping your path forward. You're not going to jump from building your foundation to forecasting. You need to go through baselining around your general analysis, around optimization, before you can get into those future state, more mature, more robust activities. You can't you know, skip past go. You got to collect your $200 to get to each phase of this to really have that foundation that you're building on as you build each floor. You can't build the 4th floor without a 3rd floor. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of baseline a little bit around attribution. For some of you, this may be very old hat, and for some of you, you may not have thought about it this way. Or it may be a new function for you. So I kind of want to assume, you know, beginner, and then we'll go to, you know, what do I always say, Lauren? Beginner to badass, although maybe I shouldn't say that on recording. I don't know.
I think you're fine. I think you're fine. Yeah. Say beginner to baddie. How about that?
There we go. Beginner to big time. Maybe that's a good one. So when we talk about defining attribution versus ROI or and ROI, attribution is the science of determining which campaigns either drove purchases based on the revenue, or there's a corollary effect between the engagement and the revenue. Return on investment, on the opposite side, is looking at the revenue and the investments, and the engagement is the smaller piece. So where did that spend happen? And then how do we tie that all together against the revenue? The biggest challenge that I see within organizations is that they're being asked to perform attribution and or ROI exercises on campaigns for this quarter or last quarter, but they're dealing with a sales cycle that is 9, 12, 18 months long. And so I think the thing with all of this is realistic level setting and expectation setting is a really important part of this. This is going to be data that then has to be assessed, and you have to really be willing to go through that exercise. It's not going to pop out magic answers, right? So this is a science and an art, and everything we're going to look at today is that, which isn't necessarily the best answer, but it is a realistic one. And if there's anything you take away from today's session, it is that I want you to be realistic in how you level set and set expectations within your organization around reporting, attribution, and potentially even ROI as a mature function. So when we talk about attribution, we're talking about a variety of models. Often I'll hear people say our attribution model, but really what you need to do is, I think, call it your attribution program, right? There's a variety of different models. Some of them are single touch. So this would be like a first touch model, and we'll dig into a little bit more of the types of models on the next slide. And then some of them are multi-touch. And the difference here is that a single touch looks at one potential sort of flag on the field, so to speak, and what happens when they pass that flag versus multiple points that are passed in the journey. And then on a single touch, all of the revenue is attributed to just that one touch versus in a multi-touch, it's divided out across. So some of the standard models that you're likely to see looking at attribution are our single touch models, which are first touch, lead creation, and last touch, which some organizations do call middle touch because it's actually when the opportunity is created. So it is kind of actually in the middle of the journey. Historically, it's been called last touch. First touch is exactly what it sounds like. It's the first time that we encountered them. And lead creation is when they gave us their email address. So those benchmarks are sort of flags that we tend to look at and want to know what drove someone into our system, so on and so forth. The U-shape, W-shape, or custom, full path, there's a whole slew of different types of models, time decay, etc. Those all take multiple touches into account, and they associate a certain percentage against that position in the journey. So a U-shape, typically we're going to look at 40% of revenue allocated against the first touch, and then also the lead creation touch. And then any touches that occur in between those two touches would have that 20% divided across them. So if there's two touches, they'd each get 10, so on and so forth. Did someone have a question? It sounded like someone was starting to ask something. Okay, cool. When we look at things like this, we can also see custom models that are even weighted. So all of the touches get the same percentage divided across. There's a lot of different ways to build models. We're just kind of getting you familiar if you're not familiar with the various types of models that exist. So if there's one question that I get asked more often than any other, and I get this one a lot, it is, what attribution model should I use? And I love this question, but it's also a challenging question because it presupposes that there is a single model that you should use. And the reality is you need to use all of them. The reason that there are multiple models is that each model answers a different question. And so if you want to understand what's sparking initial interest, that's going to be your first touch model. If you're looking for what's driving net new names into my database, lead creation, and so on and so forth. So each model is going to answer a different question. And so when someone says, what model should I be using? Well, I say, well, all of them. And here's why. So when you talk within your organization about reporting and analytics and specifically attribution, I always encourage people to minimize that idea of an attribution model and talk about it as an attribution program, because there are multiple models that you'll need to use in order to understand how you're going to reallocate your effort or time, or where you're putting, opportunities for engagement out there based on what these different models tell you at the different points of your journey. Is there something in chat or a question, Lauren?
Not yet, but if you have one, feel free to pop it in chat if you prefer, or unmute and just join the discussion. We're open to that. Nothing yet though, Andy.
Okay, cool. Just triple checking. So the business case for attribution, I think, is one that's interesting. I find that attribution, it has one of two entry points into an organization. Either marketing or marketing operations comes and says, hi, we'd like to build out a business case for attribution and build, a need case for that budget. Or the business comes from a leadership or kind of middle level and says, hey guys, you need to be doing attribution, go figure out how to make it happen. So either you're coming and asking for it, you're being told you need to do it. But either way, that conversation usually comes at a point when the maturity of the organization is finding that it's necessary to have that data in order to make any sort of decision, you're kind of like stuck without it. So the business case for attribution, I think, is around accuracy, simplicity, having the insights, and then knowing how to allocate your budget. Even if you're not doing ROI analysis, you can still know that you should be allocating a larger number of your dollars toward, let's say, webinars versus white papers because of your overall attributable revenue amount associated with your different tactics, so on and so forth. The business case for ROI enabled attribution is really about optimizing spend. So what specific channels, sub-channels, tactics are you spending on, not just from a perspective of what's contributing to revenue, but where you actually have the highest yield on the dollars spent to have that engagement occur versus the revenue yielded. So we'll talk about that as we move into the last section. But before we get there, let's look at automating attribution data in Marketo and also in CRM. And these are some ways that you can be building out attribution data and a repository of that information for you for the future without needing necessarily an attribution tool today. So I think it's important to talk about data, what data you actually need and why you need it. There are a lot of different places in the system where you can look at different data sets or create data sets for yourself. Things like channels inside of your programs for your program types or channel types, your source information, UTM information, acquisition programs. All of these can create a wealth of data for you to be able to understand where engagement is occurring and what's causing engagement potentially to be occurring within your content. Pardon me. So this helps provide us with what we need to actually make decisions. So we're moving away from that sort of intuition or gut-based into a decision that is data-driven. So kind of reviewing person source versus UTMs versus acquisition program. Person source, I tend to think of a 30,000-foot view. This is very broad. This is what's driving people into your database initially from an external perspective. So not thinking about this as like webinars or content types or even channel per se, but more looking at this a perspective of what happened right before that. So did they get to you via organic search? Did sales put them in, CRM and they came through that way? Were they through a partner? Kind of those larger buckets. Having something like website here, you're going to find not useful because many things come for your website. How did they get to your website? That's a more interesting conversation. So focusing on actionable, interesting data for person source is key, but also keeping it at a 30,000-foot view. Then you can drill in with UTM information. So this is going to go from broad to specific, from things like medium, which is going to potentially align a bit more against your person source, into source, which is kind of funny because they're opposite, right? Where is it specifically? Google, LinkedIn, what platform? And then down to campaign. And you can have a variety of other UTMs. You can create your own. We often see things like term or ad ID or all these other things that are potentially useful. I think the thing here is really about consistency and defining what's going to sit at each level. And then finally, acquisition program. This is exceptionally specific. And this is the data point that we write at a program level inside of Marketo to specify that that person had not existed in the system before they engaged with this program. So let's start at the top. And we're going to focus on just within Marketo, how to really enable yourself in a good way. So I think the first thing is really doing a review of your channels and making sure that those are not only aligned with what is in Salesforce on your campaign type, but also that they actually accurately represent the various specific types of initiatives that you want to be benchmarking internally within themselves and also at scale. So how are trade shows doing versus webinars, et cetera. You want to make sure that your statuses are accurate and correct and that, everything is lined up. What's in Salesforce needs to be in Marketo. You need to be using them correctly in Marketo and so on and so forth. Also, think about what success means inside of your channel. A lot of attribution platforms will pull only the members of your SFDC campaign that have that responded as true, meaning success in Marketo. And so sometimes that can be counterintuitive. So webinar is one of my favorite examples. Someone registering for a webinar could actually be an acquiring action. That could be how we bring them into the database for the first time. And so if we're looking for engagement, did they attend the webinar? Maybe not. In some cases, no shows actually have a higher conversion rate than people who attended because they still want that information. They're more willing to have a sales conversation. So what your successes are here will determine what potentially gets flagged as being responded or an engagement on the SFDC side. So you need to think about that. If you're going to do everybody inside your webinar, then you may not want to include your invitees as a status update and just keep them, that's like a send a child program inside to mitigate that. So you're only looking at people that actually engaged. So you kind of want to think critically about how you're even setting up your statuses and then how you're leveraging those. Once you're creating your Marketo programs, if you are using Salesforce as your CRM, syncing those over into SFDC is critical, and having people move through is going to be really important. The program level sync is what I typically recommend for people. It's not always feasible for people to use it, but there's like a variety of reasons to use that program level sync. One, you can create directly from here. Two, it syncs at a level of 200 people from Marketo to one API call, so it can reduce the load. And finally, any program member custom fields, which we're going to talk about, can be synced over to campaign member fields now. And so for use cases like UTMs, this can be incredibly powerful. All right, so acquisition program data does need to be set at the program level. I encourage you to look at choice steps or choice additions to your flow steps for your data value changes for your acquisition programs. You want to look for people coming in. So in this case, registered is our status where we're going to set that. And we can say acquisition date is empty, set it to today, and then acquisition program is empty, write it in. You can also look at created at in last, let's say 5 minutes as a benchmark. And if it's not, then you skip it and you don't write it. So there's a couple different ways to do this depending on what you consider to be an acquisition program. Is somebody that was, purchased by sales and has been in the system for 5 years coming in and engaging in acquisition program data point that you want to write in, or do you only want to look at actually they were acquired by marketing and writing it in then? You can also look at this for a global policing program. So if acquisition program is empty as a filter, you can write with a trigger token from the program where the status has changed to write that. You can't, unfortunately, write a global acquisition program sort of operational setup because it can only be written at the program level, but at least you can police for things where it's missing. So you can use acquisition data in a variety of ways. At the program summary level, it's going to show you the total number of people that the program acquired. In the program members tab from the summary, you can also see that acquisition little icon guy right there. So you know specifically which people or person was acquired. And then also from a program performance level report, you're able to have numbers in here for your total membership, your new names, which would be related to the acquisition or acquired data point there. And then you can also get some cost analyses out of this if you're putting in program costs, which is kind of cool. So this gives you a good at a glance to see, not just in a single program, but also at scale. You can build this for a larger folder or your entire marketing activities to see what's driving in the most new names or potentially what has the most value there. So pivoting over to lead source actually has its own database or dashboard rather in your database tab. that allows you to view overall what your lead sources are. This is associated with the field person source, but the C name on that is going to be lead source, since originally way back in the day, everybody in Marketo was called a lead rather than a person. They changed that because it was confusing with the whole lead contact piece inside of Salesforce. So you're able to create views for yourself inside of your person tab, and you can actually put in all of this data called original, which is captured by Marketo on the back end. You don't need to maintain it. You can actually edit it to get at things like, what the original refer or source were. And so this is really useful and interesting if you have a legacy database where you maybe want to go do some cleanup. There's a lot of different use cases for this. I find that when it comes to managing lead source, the best approach is to have a global operational program. And the way that I like to do this is actually, this is an older one, so it has request campaigns. You could do this with executable. This is a great use case for executable campaigns. But what I like to do here is set up smart lists for what the qualifying criteria is for each lead source. And then I use it as a choice step. So that way it's whatever takes priority or precedence. So if they were created in Salesforce, I got to pull that off first as CRM, not purchase, like this person was created in CRM. Then I know I uploaded them via a trade show list, so that goes in, and so on and so forth. And by prioritizing it that way, instead of having 10 smart campaigns that all fire on person is created in this dueling banjo sort of scenario, you can mitigate that by having one entry or processing smart campaign and then all the others running off of whichever one gets called based on the first one that they qualify for. So this kind of mitigates it changing, or then one thing fires first and the wrong thing gets it, and then you have to go unlock it and unblock it from overwriting and change it again. This will help you with that a little bit. If you are going to do a global cleanup, this also helps with processing people through after the fact. So you can do a person is created and a campaign request at the top, and then request those people from a smart list and kind of push them in that way to process them. So there's a lot of different benefits to looking at a global lead source management setup. You just have to remember to unblock updates and then reblock updates if you're going to do a legacy system update across lead source, and do it during a time where it's not going to impact your MQLs getting over to sales by backing up the API. So let's talk about UTMs. So UTMs, which are urchin tracking modules, are a process by which we can append data at the end of a URL to let us know where that person came in from. There's a whole slew of different online generators. You can create a spreadsheet in order to create them that way. There's a variety of ways, but I think the key here is to make sure that you are using them wherever possible, to be consistent in how you create them. So I always use entirely lowercase for all of my UTMs. That way I don't have any issues with case, because proper case versus lowercase versus all caps are going to categorize in different ways when the data is output. So you want consistency here. I think that's key. And then keeping them short and sweet, you know what they mean, is a best practice. So program member custom fields are actually probably one of the top use cases for UTM containment. And I love this because what it means is I can have a separate set of UTMs tracked at each program level. So I can have, this is the UTM specific to this webinar when they registered. This is the UTM set specific to the second, third, 40th, 400th engagement. They're each going to be separately tracked. So if you're going to be doing this, you need to start by creating program member custom fields in your admin section. Once you have those, you're going to add them in as that change program member data set into your programs. You're going to do this at your program template level if you are using program templates. So if you have a pre-contained clone this to do a webinar, you would want to set this up there. And then you're going to write those in. Now there's a couple limitations. Program member custom fields, you can only get 20 of them currently. You cannot delete them. So once they're in, those are your 20. So start with the 5 or 10 you know you need, and maybe don't try to run through all 20 at the very beginning. You can't change the field type and you can't remove them. So once they're in, they're there. So just triple check the work. With this, once you process them, you're gonna write them in. I like to use temp fields and actually pull that in when they're written. And you can write them either by having hidden fields on your form or by using a snippet of code that persists those forward and then pushes them in via the API name of each field at the time that person fills out the form. But you're only going to get your UTMs when a form submit occurs. So you're not necessarily going to have these on things where you're not gating. But you can write them in your flow step as those process in. And then once those are processed, you can kick off a process to write them in globally. So what I like to do is write them into my temp fields. From the temp field, I write into the program member custom fields for that specific engagement. Then I trigger my global, I write them into my most recent fields, and then I null my temp fields. And what that means is that my temp fields stay blank 99.9% of the time. So that means if I have one marketer that's submitting a UTM parameter string that has 3 UTMs in it and someone else gives me 5, that the person who submits the 5, I don't have 2 of them hang around and then the 3 come in and get cross-contaminated. So by having those temps that I only write into ever and then null out, and then I'm writing into potentially my original fields, but also my most recent and also the program level fields, I maintain a really solid data set that is always concisely that set of UTMs, and I never have to worry about that cross-contamination coming in. So once you've written your parameters in on your program member custom fields, if you are using SFDC as your CRM, you can write them over directly. As of December of last year, they updated these fields to be able to sync directly to program member custom field to campaign member fields on the SFDC side, which is really cool. You do need to make sure that the field type on the SFDC side matches your field type in Marketo first. And secondly, and this is a weird gotcha, it has to have always matched. So if you create a date field in Salesforce and then you change it to a date time field and try to sync it with a date time stamped field and a program member field, they will not match up. So it's going to be based on what it was at time of creation in Salesforce. It's a weird gotcha, but it's very powerful. So I love this for UTMs. I also love this for actual engagement date or time. So this is really useful for those of you that may have a strong sync delay between your systems. So if it's taking 24 hours for people to sync across, the actual engagement time date stamp can then be used for your touch point time date stamp after the fact. It's great for mitigating things like they engaged today at the trade show, but the list won't be uploaded for 3 weeks. So the actual engagement day is today, those types of things. So there's a lot of great use cases, and syncing them over makes it for a very seamless data set that you don't have to think about too much. So what this data looks like is essentially this. On the campaign member record, you'll see your UTM fields with the data that's been passed over. And then you can see this in your reporting. So I love this because it allows you to look at things like what's the medium and the source at scale, that 30,000 foot view of sort of what UTMs you're seeing across all campaign members. And since campaign members are a unified object in Salesforce, you can run one report instead of having to do a lead report and then a contact report as well. So this can be done for things like campaign type and then drilling into medium or source. And you can look all the way down at a specific campaign. Now, in order to do ROI, you can't use just Salesforce. You have to have a place to put your spend. So if you're going to be connecting spend with lead engagement to get to ROI, your options are SFDC campaign-based UTMs and then data extraction to a BI tool where you're then pulling in spend data from a secondary source or an attribution partner. You can try to get all crazy in your actual campaign object with different spend on different channels or sub-channels, but I find that that's difficult to maintain and it doesn't necessarily generate the best, most concise data coming into your BI tool. But if you're trying to get to ROI, know that you're probably not going to be able to do it inside of Salesforce alone. There's just not a native place for Salesforce to house the spend that really makes sense within the infrastructure of that tool. If you are pulling it into a BI tool, then you can start to get at some attribution with UTMs, where you're pulling in this data from your campaign member, like medium, against specific campaigns. So how did this campaign perform against medium? What were the attribution amounts, the ops influence, and the average ops size? This does not have ROI, so there's no return on that investment shown here. You can also look at this as a 30,000 foot roll up, right? So how did the brand do as a whole with medium source outside of tactic? Okay. So these really are going to be possible when you're using an attribution vendor or have built out a custom object in Salesforce to give you that attribution piece that ties the campaign member against the SFDC opportunity. This does not natively occur inside of Salesforce today.
So Andy, we do have a question before
Yes.
we move on from Taylor in the chat. He says, maybe less of a Marketo specific question, but have you seen other customers use persistent UTMs on their sites to track original source if the person is visiting multiple pages after the initial acquisition landing page or ad? How did they accomplish persistent UTMs? Great question.
So the way that I've accomplished this is in the script that I create, I look at persisting UTMs across multiple pages for the current visit, and then a secondary tracking that persists for that browser across multiple visits. So the first time that that person hits off of that device, it's going to track those UTMs against that original set, and it will retain, it depends on your compliance. So some companies can retain for 15 days, some can retain for 90 days, but they can keep that original set, and they're going to persist those until the form fill happens, and then via the API right into both the original and also those temp fields. And then you have that capacity to have the two data sets simultaneously. So that's how I think about it. If you're using that script, you can also enhance it with something like a Google Analytics to pull in GA data where UTMs are not present. And in that way, you would also pull in it was organic via Google if there were no UTMs, which is kind of a cool functionality for both the original and that temp or most recent data set.
Awesome. Taylor, pipe in the chat. Let us know if that answers your question. We're happy to have a side conversation after the event here. Feel free to contact Andy or me on LinkedIn and we can continue the conversation. Maria, Andy also has a question for you. If you have, for example, an evergreen white paper download campaign, like a white paper on the website, and also a marketing promo campaign that uses the same white paper for promotion, do you stamp the UTM at one program or at both? I have some opinions here, but Andy, feel free to chime in with your thoughts.
So I tend to keep my content in a single program. I don't replicate that out into other programs. I keep it in just a single program. And then I track the UTMs for whatever the first engagement with the individual with that piece of content is the first time I see them. So I'm not going to overrate the UTMs the second or 40th time or whatever that they come through. I'm only going to do it the first. But then within that UTM data set on that single program for that asset, I'm able to see if it was campaign A promotion or the standard promotion or the B or whatever that's driving the most engagement, and understand which version or location of that content is getting the most engagement. But that way I don't divide the potential impact of that single piece of content into different places, thereby reducing the potential for it to be at the top list of contributors toward, pipeline bookings or revenue.
And I would just add there that, when you have the source and the medium at your disposal for customization, I like to know at a granular level, like not to upset my attribution, but to know with some granularity about success at the channel level. I would want to know the difference between the evergreen download organic versus paid versus internal promotions. And I would stamp accordingly with, maybe UTM source. And I would track that all in a master's spreadsheet. I don't kind of like the wild and free approach to UTM tracking. Unless you document it, then it's going to become confusing, even if you're the one architecting and designing the logic. So I keep everything in a master spreadsheet, but I definitely make it granular enough to track who's doing what and where when it comes to assets. Even if it's the same asset across a few different channels, I like to know where my volume and my traffic are coming from.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So let's talk about the evolution of an attribution mindset into an ROI mindset. So many people start out at this sort of stage one, or you've been there in the past, where you looked at this from a perspective of, here was this webinar, here's what we spent across these different channels, here's what the cost per lead was, and then here's how many leads we got. And the instinct is often to look at CPL and make a decision based on that, on where you'll reduce spend. So if my cost per lead was not so great on, let's say LinkedIn, or really high on Facebook, I might look at pulling back on those because I'm getting such a low return on the count of leads that are coming in. I think this is a common conversation that I've seen over the last 15 years, honestly, a very CPL focused conversation. And it's a natural beginning point because it's easy data to obtain. The other thing I'll note here, and part of the reason that this is outlined other than that it has the lowest cost, is I always make sure to associate spend against everything, even my organic or what would be considered SEO. First, nothing is free. Your website takes work to optimize, it takes work to maintain. And if you put $0 there as the spend, then you're not going to have an ROI calculation, because 0 times or divided by anything is going to be 0. So this gives you a baseline of data to work with, which I like. It also recognizes that there is effort, there is spend that goes into play there. So as we look at evolving this, I think the next step that we can talk about is moving from, once we have that attributable link, from leads into a deals conversation, or at least an opportunities conversation, right? So in this case, we're talking about deals. I'm saying this is bookings. This isn't necessarily revenue yet, right? And I think it's really important as marketers to know if our finance department is talking about pipeline and revenue, if they're talking about pipeline and bookings, which means it's committed revenue, but we don't necessarily have that money in the bank yet, and to be speaking their language. But when we start to look at the deals calculation, right, what that looks like, suddenly this is going to change, especially if we have an average deal size. In this case, our average deal size is calculated at 50K, of where this is ultimately going to play out. So we had 88 leads off of Google Ads. 13 of those became deals. So suddenly we're changing where we're going, but also we're noticing, hey, we had 8 deals off of LinkedIn, only 1 deal off of Facebook, only 1 deal off of Twitter. And so how does this change our cost per lead versus our cost per deal, right? Our cost per lead for Outbrain was $71, but our cost per deal was $500. So how does that start to evolve and change the conversation? So moving from there, once we can get at attribution, that starts to tell us, instead of an average deal size, what is the actual marketing touch revenue? And this is where the rubber really meets the road in attribution and the thinking, because it's not just how many deals did we make, but are we seeing a higher return on some types of sub-channels than others when it comes to webinars? Does that data hold out across multiple webinars, across all webinar types, or across specific topics that are presented within our webinars or content? And so if you can give yourself enough lead time on analysis from when the event or the engagement is potentially happening to when you're actually reporting on it, and this may take 6 or 12 or 18 months, which is the tricky part, because often the business can't stand to wait that long. So if you can pivot from leads to deals and then get to the estimated revenue from there, and then kind of draw out the conversation as you get a longer lead time, more data from the time of the engagement to the marketing touch revenue, at that point, you're going to be able to start pivoting the conversation on its head. So in this particular scenario, our marketing touch revenue and our average deal size for LinkedIn is much higher. It's actually better. If we'd had a conversation at the beginning, we probably would have taken a large amount of that 6K and put it elsewhere. But now what this is telling me is that I should probably actually be taking, maybe that 3K, not all of it, but a good chunk of it that I put into Facebook, and seeing if I can bolster that into the LinkedIn and continue to see similar returns or results from that increased spend. And so when we have the marketing touch revenue, we can start to do basic ROI calculations where we're looking at the marketing touch revenue versus the spend and getting our ROI off of that. So this is a campaign level analysis. This sits in that defining impact that's earlier in the journey. But the discussion here and the mindset here is what helps us start to make that leap from doing a single campaign analysis or ROI into looking at automated attribution and ROI at scale. When we're running enough campaigns where we need to be able to pivot that conversation, that's where I think an attribution platform or partner starts to come into play. And it's a good conversation to have. Different vendors have different things that they offer, but having it be at scale and automated, I think, is ultimately why many people choose to go in that direction. I think it's important, though, before you look at that, to have sort of that big picture on reporting and talk about how you're going to use the reporting, when you're going to use it, regular intervals for reporting, and for the conversations that you have about that. Organizational consensus is huge here. What are the items that you're measuring? Why are you measuring them? What's impactful about that? What will change based on the data that you get from those conversations and those data points? And then right-sizing your reporting, I think, is probably the biggest thing. I'm going to build completely different data sets and reports for my CMO or my CFO than I am for a director or an everyday campaign manager who's just in the weeds, right? They all care about different things. They're all needing different data to do their job. So making sure that in advance of creating the data, I've aligned with them on what they need and what they will use, and that I'm building for that future state in it, like just from the first day, is going to be, I think, really critical. And then finally talking about whether or not you're going to do benchmarking. So most of the systems have the data as it exists today, but if you want to benchmark for what it was for, Q4 at the end of your fiscal year last year versus where we're at with, the Q4 for the end of the fiscal year this year, if you haven't benchmarked it, that's going to be tricky. So talking about if you're going to use, a BI tool for that, or if you're going to do a deck repository and then kind of compare that way, it's important to think about that. The final piece that I'll leave you with, and then we'll look at additional questions, is really determining where you are in your maturity. I think a lot of people run to get attribution platforms, and it can be the right answer. But I think it's more important to think about where you are and where you're going to be, and then right size against that. So how much do you spend as an organization per year, per quarter on your marketing initiatives? If it is, significantly more than an attribution platform is going to cost, is that the time to make that investment? If it's smaller than what an attribution partner costs, then it might not make sense, or you might want to look at something that's a little bit more at scale with the total investment that you're trying to optimize on. What's your average deal size? If you have not that many deals, but a huge deal size, you may be able to do it manually, or it may not be worth your time because you're looking to land more whales. And then this is the biggest piece. Who's going to own this on staff? Because this is a race car, and a race car needs a pit crew. It needs people to change the tires, change the oil, refuel it, keep it running, make sure everything's in tip-top fashion. If you don't have someone on staff who can run it and you don't have the capacity to bring someone in, you're going to be hard pressed to get winning results out of it from just having it sitting there on the lot, not actually being driven. And then finally, and I think this is one of the most critical things that I've experienced, is how long is it going to be before you need this kind of data at scale? And how much time is it going to take you to ramp it up? Because if you need it in 6 months from now, you should definitely be talking about looking at either creating that data set or talking with a vendor, a platform that can do that for you. You need it 12 months from now and your sales cycle is 9 months, like that's probably getting pretty close. If you want it 2 years from now, then this is the time to be planning and assessing, but not necessarily implementing, and so on and so forth. So I think the timing here and also the right size are equally critical. But it is finding something that works for you. And there are a slew of different platforms out there, everything from something that runs at about 4K a year to something that'll probably run you 40K a year, all the way up to things that if you were at a super high, awesome enterprise level, will run you $400,000 a year. So I think there's a right size for each org and the needs, but you can only get so far with the native platforms. And I think it's knowing where that line is and knowing when you need to cross it that will help you hit your stride with your maturity around reporting on the contribution and impact of the activities that you're doing. All right, with that, I guess, should we turn it over to questions? And I don't know if we want to turn off recording. If anyone wants to come off mute, maybe not be on the official recording, we can certainly do that. But in advance of that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. And I look forward to additional questions.
I had one for you, Andy, and I kind of know your preference, but just to kind of tap into the knowledge, so that maybe you could make a recommendation. I like Data Studio for data stitching to get all my aggregate platform data put together in kind of near real time, so I can make decisioning on, channel optimization or paid search and social strategy or things of that nature. What do you like for visualization? I know you wrangle Tableau on the daily, but what's your utopia for reporting?
I mean, I do like Tableau. I've had some success with Data Studio, but I find it sometimes finicky and I can't get it to display exactly the way I want to, or it'll break on the data source. I think that's the challenge. I think it doesn't matter what you build in. What matters is that you have confidence in the data pipeline that's bringing the data over into that visualization tool, if that's what you're using, and that you have clear articulation across the various boards that you're looking at, that you're calling a spade, that you're drilling into things in the same way, the calculations are done the same, you're working off of the same numbers. I can't tell you how many times I've seen reporting where one part of the org in one department is doing revenue reporting and another one is doing revenue reporting, and the numbers don't match because they're using different fields on the opportunity object, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's more about consistency and having confidence in your data. The second that anyone pokes a hole and says, I don't know if that's right, game over, right? You have to make sure there's alignment there and that you have high confidence levels in it, or you're going to be challenged.
I love it. So people and process over platform all day makes total sense. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you to Andy for joining.